Now that we can add data to Firebase so that we can store data on our server and that we can fetch data whenever we visit all meetups, now with that we got the core functionality built in. The last feature which I want to add here is this favorites feature. This button here should be clickable, and when we click it, this meetup should be added to our favorites. Then on the My Favorites page, I want to see a list of all my favorites. And of course, as soon as an item is a favorite, I want to be able to unfavorite it. And then I also want to show a little badge here in the navigation next to My Favorites, where we see the current count of favorites. That's the last feature I want to add. And for this, we'll need to manage some state which affects more than one component. Because our list of favorites is some state that should cause the UI to update. Because we, for example, will have that badge here, which shows the current number of favorites. And of course, this button should change once an item is a favorite. So we'll have different parts of this application that will be affected by our state. And because that's the case, because we'll have a state that affects more than one component, we will need a mechanism of managing that state globally and distributing that state to different components. Because just using use state inside of a single component doesn't necessarily do the trick anymore, because that only affects one component. Now, one thing we could do is we could lift the state up. That means that we could, for example, manage our favorites state in app.js, and then we pass it into all the components that are interested as props. So to the layout component, which has access to the main navigation component, which is where I want to show this badge in the end, to that component, we could pass the number of favorites if we manage the favorites state in the app component. And then to the favorites page component, we could pass the array of favorite meetups. So we could manage the state here in the app component and then just distribute it through props. That would work, but it has a couple of downsides. One problem would be that if we have a bigger application with different states that affect different components, we have to manage more and more state in this app component, and hence this app component becomes bigger and bigger. And that's maybe not ideal. Another problem is that if we pass state down through props, that we can end up with very long prop chains. We pass the number of favorites to the layout component, and from there we pass it into main navigation. So we already pass props to layout just so that this component can then pass that data on to another component. Whilst that is not horrible, it's also not necessarily great, and it can also make our code a bit harder to maintain. And because we have issues like this, there are state management solutions for managing application-wide state in a more convenient way. One very popular state management package is Redux. I cover it in my course, but for many scenarios, we don't even need Redux, because React also has a built-in state management solution for application-wide state. And that's a feature called Context. Now for this, to add this context feature, I'll add a new folder in the source folder, and I'll name it store. The folder name is up to you, but store is a common convention since we will set up the state store for this application. Inside of store, I'll add a favorites-context.js file, and in this file, I'll now create such a context. For this, in this file, we first of all import create context from React, so that's a function exposed by the React library, and we can then call create context. And this does what the name implies. It creates a context. We don't know yet what exactly such a context is, but hey, we are creating one at least. Now, context in the end is a JavaScript object. And we can store this in a constant, and I'll name it favorites context. I start with a capital F because this object, which is created by context, actually will contain a React component. And when you build your own React components, the convention which you should follow is that you start with a capital character for your component names. So that's why I store my context in a favorites context constant here. Now create context also takes an argument, and that argument is the initial value for that context. So the initial value for this application or component-wide state. And that can be any value of your choice. It could, for example, be an object. Let's say an object where we have a favorites key, which is an empty array initially, because we have no favorites at the beginning, and maybe a total favorites key, which is 0 initially, which is the total number of favorites. That could be our context. But like this, it's not too useful. We also need ways of changing these values, of adding and removing favorites. And that's why I will also add a component in this file. So a component function, which I'll name favorites context provider. This component will be a regular React component, but it will have the job of providing this context to all the components that are interested in listening to the values. So all the components that need values from the context. And this component here, the favorites context provider component, will also be responsible for updating the context values. Now for this, what we'll do here is we'll return favorites context, so this constant which we created here, dot provider. That's a component this context object has built in. And this provider component needs to be wrapped around all the components that are interested in interacting with that context. Now, this favorites context provider component, which we are building here, itself should be wrapped around other components later. I plan on using it in index.js to wrap it around my entire app so that all the components in the app have access to the context. And therefore, what we can do here is we can accept props and simply wrap this provider component, which we get from this context object, around props children. That means that we can now wrap our component here around any other components, and those components will be wrapped by context automatically. I hope this makes sense. Now, why am I doing it like this? Because now in this favorites context provider component, which we're building here, we can manage our context data. We can manage that with state, because this component, which we are working on here, is still a regular React component. So when we manage state in there, when we change that state, that component here will still execute again and will be re-evaluated. And that means that if we change our context value in this component and we pass this context value to the provider, all components that are listening to our context will be updated and will get that latest updated data. And in case it's not 100% clear yet, we'll get there step by step because we're now going to add the logic for this. In favorites context provider, I'll create a context object and I'll pass this context object as a value to favorites context dot provider. This component, which is exposed by this favorites context object, wants a value prop where we pass the current context value. We set the initial values here when we create the context, but we can then update those values and pass the latest values with help of that value prop. And whenever that value changes, all components that are listening to our context will be updated in the end. That's how this works. So now we just need to derive this context object and its values dynamically. And that's where use state comes into play now. We can manage some state here in this favorites context provider, and we can manage an array of favorited meetups here. So here we have the user favorites, let's say, and a function for setting those user favorites. Now here, this context object which we construct, which holds the latest values that should be exposed to our components, that object now has a favorites key because we define that here in the initial context value as well. And we set our current user favorites array, this state snapshot, as a value. So when the state changes, this value will change and we'll have a new context object and we'll pass this new updated context object to all the components that are wrapped by this provider in the end. And I'll also set total favorites here, and that is simply user favorites.length. Like this. Now we just need a way of changing our state here.